Welcome to the CanesInSight Daily Podcast, powered by Anajar and Levine Accident Attorneys. It is our weekly baseball pod. We got Mr. Perfect himself, Javi Salas. We'll be talking to him about another tough weekend for the Hurricanes and some big picture trends as far as the team taking a step back from every single game, every single loss, and looking at some big picture trends with the team statistically and otherwise. But first, want to hear from some of the best friends that Canes baseball has.
This episode of the CanesInSight podcast is brought to you by our friends at Sala Astorita & Cox, a boutique law firm focusing on securities regulatory matters, broker-dealer and investment advisor regulation, white-collar criminal defense, complex commercial litigation, and securities arbitration and litigation. The firm aggressively represents clients throughout the nation. Contact them now at 561-989-9080. or visit them online at salalaw.com.
All right, let's jump into it. We are here with Mr. Perfect, Javi Salas, through a perfect game for the University of Miami that has done a lot of broadcasts this year and no one's more plugged in to the program at its essence, including this year's team. So, Javi, man, appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, D, happy to be here, man. It feels like Groundhog Day all over again, man. A tough weekend for the Canes again in Atlanta against Georgia Tech.
Yeah, we can't even get you in the studio anymore. We used to get you in the studio. Now, after a couple more losses, you're doing it from home or from your girlfriend's house. Fiance, I apologize, Mrs.
Fiance's
Perfect.
house. Yeah.
So, let's look. We can talk about the series. Let's start there, but I want to dig a little deeper. But starting with the series and the midweek, started off right. You had a midweek game win against FAU, who's been a thorn in Miami's side. FIU jumped out to an early lead. You had a Cuvée double, Ashton Crowther coming up with the win. I know you did that game. So what are some of the things you saw from the booth in that win?
Yeah, look, I mean, you mentioned it perfectly, right? FAU's been a thorn in our side the better part of the season. Miami lost the first two games on the road, and Boca have come back and even the series now 2-2 with FAU. So all in all, I mean, a nice comeback in the series. But, I mean, it was a tough game. Look, FAU jumped out to a 2-0 lead. Miami was battling the whole way through. Saw, a nice comeback, I'd like to say. I mean, one of those things where the game wasn't very well played on either side. I think, the coaching staff will tell you that. Miami, sort of squeaked out with a win there due to some FAU blunders and errors and some pitching mishaps. But again, nice to be in the win column in what looked like a nice precursor going into the weekend series against Georgia Tech. Again, with this club, wins are certainly a little more difficult to come by. So obviously a nice win against FAU. Didn't necessarily bleed into the weekend as many would have hoped and expected.
Look, it started off nice, right? So go first game, 6-4 win for Miami over Georgia Tech, and you saw the most talented players on the team really step up. You had Gage Zeal with the dominant start, Brian Walters, electric stuff in relief, and then Daniel Cuvée with the go-ahead homer. So it's kind of like all the best parts of Miami you saw in that 6-4 victory to start the series, right?
Yeah, look, I think it all starts with Gage Zeal, right? And Gage has been absolutely incredible in ACC play and has had a tremendous overall season, right? We're looking at a sub 3.5 ERA from Gage over the course of the year. And, a year that started with a couple tough outings, right? I mean, Gage didn't necessarily get off to the best start, but he's by far and away been the most consistent pitcher for the University of Miami, the most consistent starter. Gives you a great outing. And then to your point, you have your best players, perform. Daniel Cuvée with an outstanding performance, sort of willing the team to a victory. And that's sort of been the recipe, right? I mean, we talked about the long ball for the Hurricanes, right? If the games that they hit more home runs than their opponents usually lead to victories. Not a recipe that has necessarily been, the bread and butter for a lot of teams throughout the country. I think, when Miami has been stifled and faces some good starting pitching, as we saw on Saturday and Sunday, it's difficult to lift the ball. It's difficult to score runs. So again, look, Friday night was a tremendous win for the team. It looked like it was the makings of, hey, can we win a series? Can we sort of turn the tide from what's been a very difficult ACC slate thus far? And you were, buoyed by Gage Zeal, Daniel Cuvée, and then obviously a great performance by Brian Walters. And I think, in a season where there hasn't been a lot of bright spots, Brian Walters has certainly solidified himself as that premier arm in the back of the bullpen. A guy who bounced back from Tommy John last year, an injury that there's no perfect science to it. So some guys come back in 12 months. Some guys take more like 16 to 18 months. We're seeing now the Brian Walters at like 14, 15 months really come into his own. The fastball velocity is upticked. The slider's really good. the next evolution is going to be, can he pitch back-to-back days? Can he pitch more than once in a weekend? But the stuff is certainly there, and the trajectory. I mean, I think this guy's probably going to be the opening day closer next year, if you had to ask me right now.
And that Walters family has been very good to Miami, between his uncle Matt, national championship starter, defensive line 2001, his brother Andrew tearing up the minor leagues after a great Miami career, and now Brian doing his part. So, hope there's more Walters in the pipeline. Saturday, 9-4 loss, kind of more of the same. Short outing for Schlesinger. You had Daniel Covey showing off his power, but overall, it seemed like your standard game where the pitching was inconsistent and the offense didn't perform.
Yeah, look, and the recipe for Miami has been the starting pitchers got to go deep into the game. You got to get to that Walters, Robert sort of area of the game, this 7th, 8th, and 9th, where Miami does have answers at the end of the ball game. And unfortunately, when the starter just doesn't go deep, it's difficult to win any game. And I think we've sort of hit a point in the season now where we've seen some inconsistencies from Rafe and Herrick, and putting my pitcher's hat on. I mean, you start looking at the stats, right? I mean, Rafe, they're hitting over 330 against him, right? And that's something that if I were a pitching coach, I'm sort of circling that. And then you look at Herrick Hernandez, similarly, a lot of extra base hits. I think he's given up close to 30 extra base hits on the season, which is a large number, right? I mean, those Sunday games are usually the swing games in series, as it was evidenced this weekend. And you got to make sure you have a guy that, number one, can sort of pitch you into that 5th and 6th inning, and number two, can keep the game close. I mean, we see a lot of teams where starting pitching isn't necessarily their forte. Sunday games are usually one of those games where, hey, it's a battle of attrition. Who has the freshest bullpen? Who can put more guys on base? Who can command more of a lead? So those two guys have sort of hit a wall. I think from Rafe's standpoint on Saturday, it looks like he's hit a point in his season where he hasn't pitched this deep into a season ever in his life. So ERA over 6. I mentioned that batting average against. Just a tough spot. It's a tough way to sort of, after a nice win on Friday night, to go into your Saturday game and not get any length out of your starter. It just puts a ton of taxing on your bullpen. And we've noted it. Miami just doesn't have the bullpen to sort of outlast teams in these sorts of situations. So, the shortened Rafe start really put the team in a tough predicament. And then, that bleeds into Sunday, and we all know what happened on Sunday.
So, look, that's the weekend. A lot of the same. Sunday start, 17-1. Herrick, like you mentioned, getting crushed on the extra base hits and having some big innings. It's less said the better. That's kind of the burn the game film kind of game. I want to talk big picture. Beginning of the season, we were talking about the batting being ahead of the pitching and the batting carrying us to these wins early on in the ACC and in non-conference. Now that I've taken a step back, and really when you look at the stats, the publicly available stats, just the big picture, not getting deep in the analytics, but just the publicly available stats for the ACC, 14 teams. Miami's 12th in home runs. This is batting. 12th in slugging, 13th on base percentage, 11th in average, 13th in steals, which I know was an emphasis before the season, and 11th in fielding percentage on the defensive end. So really, the fielding percentage is not good. And then just the offensive stats at the bottom of the league. I mean, what happened to this offense? How do you evaluate this offense now that we've seen a larger sample size?
Yeah, look, I mean, what we saw the first couple weeks of the season, I think, not necessarily an anomaly, but we saw, Blake Sear, Jason Torres, Daniel Cavey carrying this lineup, right? It was 3 guys. It was a 3-headed monster. And when you have those 3 guys clicking at the same time, which the Canes did, I think it can mask a lot of issues, right? And I think that's what we saw in essence, was a 3-headed monster that hit a ton of home runs, got a ton of extra base hits, drove in a ton of runs. And the rest of the lineup was kind of just along for the ride. Like, hey, get on base when you can, draw a couple walks, make sure that when these guys come up to bat, there's runners in scoring position. I think what we've seen, and to your point, the numbers don't lie, D. Look, it's a 14-team league. Miami's at the bottom third of all those offensive categories you named earlier. So when you try to evaluate, like, hey, where do we go wrong? Well, number one, I think the absence of Blake Sear played a huge role in this. I think as soon as he got hurt, we saw the offensive numbers, off a precipice, right? We saw Jason Torres start to struggle. Daniel Cavey came down to earth a little bit. Granted, he's picked it back up, but when you have that 3-headed monster, just a lot was put on their shoulders. I've sort of seen the bottom of the lineup. It's been kind of a revolving door. We haven't really seen an everyday shortstop. We haven't seen, the first base situation was fluid this weekend with Jason Torres. Haven't gotten the same production out of the catching position with Perez and Scanlon. Lorenzo Carrier has been in and out of the lineup. Lucas Costello. So it's been difficult for Coach Fenster and for JD to put together a lineup every single day that sort of makes sense and can help those guys at the top of the lineup that are really doing their part. So look, it's in a league where offense has sort of taken off. Obviously teams are hitting over 300, slugging all over the park. And it's a nationwide trend. Baseball, you got to hit the ball, you got to score runs to win games. Miami right now is just not in a place to do that. They have not shown that, number one, the home run pace was sustainable, and number two, they weren't necessarily all that great at manufacturing runs. A lot of the close games were, going the opposite way just because Miami couldn't get runners over, couldn't bunt guys, couldn't hit a sac fly in a key situation. So all in all, I think you have to evaluate. We had a three-headed monster at the beginning of the year. We lost one of those guys. The other, Cuvée and Torres got pitched significantly differently in the ACC slate. It's a tough conference, tough pitching, but Miami didn't do enough to manufacture runs to stay close in games. And then I think you have some of these, anomalies where it's a 17-1 game on Sunday. Miami gets one hit, right? And that's a product of, hey, we weren't necessarily ready to play, I think. Georgia Tech is playing with their hair on fire. They're trying to make a regional. They have, everything to gain. They're kind of playing with house money. They got 3 games in hand. So, I mean, realistically, you look at that performance on Sunday, and it kind of just encapsulates everything that's sort of gone wrong with the Canes the last 6 or 7 weeks.
Now, look, I am not a scout or I'm not a baseball person like that. I'm just a fan in the stands. But it seems to me, just looking at these ACC games and looking at the other teams, they look better in their uniform. I mean, they just look bigger. They're moving better. I know we were talking off air about JD Urso playing first base, which physically seems just not right. What can you tell us about the overall? You've been around some great Miami teams, just the overall size and athleticism of this Miami ball club.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where are the athletes on the roster right now, and I think baseball's trending in a direction. You look at some of the physicality of players, right, and the versatility of guys. I like to look at the major league level because I think the major league level should inform how you evaluate your roster, right? You look at a guy like Mookie Betts, right? Mookie Betts is a Gold Glove right fielder, steps in and can play shortstop at the drop of a hat. He played second base last year, right? So these are really athletic guys that play multiple positions. We kind of see, this is the trend, right? You see a Shohei Ohtani, he's 6'5", runs like a deer, legging out triples, and he hits balls 450 feet. So Miami, I think in terms of, looking forward, we got to get more athletic. I think you got to get more athletic at key positions. We're looking at up the middle, right? Catcher, shortstop, center field. That's kind of like the nucleus and the heart of a baseball team. That's where you want to have your best guys. Catching, Jack Scanlon has done a nice job. I think, obviously this will be his last season. Carlos Perez, final season of eligibility. We're going to need to get a catcher in place there for sure, a starting catcher next season. Shortstop, again, has been a revolving door. We've had a lot of Antonio Jimenez, a lot of JD Urso, not a lot of consistency from either guys. And, it's the final year of eligibility for Jacoby Long. And Jacoby's had a really nice season. Don't get me wrong. He's really solidified himself as an everyday center fielder for the Canes. But that's sort of the heartbeat of your baseball team, is right up the middle. And I think Miami's got to get stronger in that regard. You obviously look at Daniel Cuvée and Blake Sear. Those guys are going to be back. You have to imagine, Daniel Cuvée is going to be an freshman All-American. He's going to be all ACC, second team, third team, whatever it is, wherever they decide to put him on. Blake Sear with a tremendous freshman year gets sort of, unfortunate luck breaking his thumb. You're going to have that guy back. You're going to have Jason Torres back. So there's some building blocks. I think, moving forward, we got to get a little more athletic. I think that's sort of the mold. I think, Coach Fenster, Coach Arteaga, they understand that. They know what the modern day baseball player looks like. And it's not hard to find. You turn on the TV, you watch any big league baseball game, there's guys that look the part. I mean, they're physical, they're imposing, and that's sort of the guys you want to build your roster.
On the pitching side, there's a bunch of different stats, but for the most part, I'd say Miami's about 10th in the league. So 10th out of 14 is behind them. What are you seeing from the pitching staff as far as, you think they're pitching to their talent, above their talent, below their talent? How do you see their performance relative to what they bring to the table?
Yeah, look, I think, you ask anybody on that staff, they'd be disappointed with the pitching output this season, right? I mean, you look at just from a numbers standpoint, obviously ERA is not a number that's necessarily looked at a whole lot. And I don't have advanced analytics in front of me, but I'm sure, the coaching staff is looking at that. But you look at the batting average against, right? And I mentioned Herrick Hernandez earlier, being susceptible to the extra base hit. And I think that's something that you want to circle, right? Like, number one, our guys have been hittable. We've given up a ton of runs. Our ERA, I think, is north of 6 right now, D, which is it's a jarring number, right? When you're used to seeing Miami staffs, in the threes. Some have gotten into the twos, right? I mean, Miami's a program that has sort of held its stake with pitching staffs, and this year's addition of the staff is not something that I think is very emblematic of that. They got to get back to basics. I think there's just been an issue with walking guys, being hittable, and it just gets down to getting ahead in counts, right? I think I was reading a Greg Maddux quote, and he was talking about the evolution of baseball in today's day and age, and guys throwing harder in eras that he had never seen before. He's like, look, I just worried about execution. I think that's one of the lost arts of pitching is, as Velo hits numbers that people haven't seen before, people still have to execute pitches. You have to understand how to navigate a baseball game. Starters have to go deep into games. Relievers got to come in throwing strikes. And then the back end of the bullpen has to be strong. I think the one thing that Miami sort of has, again, another bright spot. I mentioned Brian Walters earlier. It's been, putting Nick Robert in some tough situations, right? A freshman getting experience as a ninth inning guy at Miami, pitching in, high stress situations in the ACC. That's going to help him. That's going to help his career sort of take off. But these weeks are evaluative weeks, right? Like you have to, as a staff, you have to understand, hey, this is what I have on my roster right now. This is what I think my roster will be next season. These are the guys I think will have impacts next year. These are the subset of guys that need to go play summer ball and work on things like these games. While obviously Miami's had a down year, the record's not where it wants to be. We're fighting for an ACC tournament berth. There are still baseball games that are important for evaluating talent, evaluating your roster, and seeing what sort of needs you have going into next season.
We're going to be at the BYU series this weekend. I'll be there on Friday. I guess you'll be there on Thursday. Yep. Any young player, whether it's in the pen, on the field, that you're watching to say, I want to see what this guy can do?
Yeah, look, I think we've sort of had a freshman pitching staff that we haven't necessarily seen a whole lot of. I'm looking at Chris Diaz. I'm looking at Jordan Vargas, Brandon Oliveira, three guys that have had success in some spurts, but there's more. I think there's a little more to be desired. I think these are the kinds of weekends you want to kind of, take the training wheels off those guys and see, hey, look, to my point, we got to see what we have in you. I have to understand, hey, do you profile as a starting pitcher? Do you profile as a reliever? Are you the kind of person that I can send to summer ball with, a list of items that I want you to work on and come back in the fall in September and October and say, hey, Coach Gutierrez, Coach Arteaga, I did this. I threw 40 innings. Like I remember in my career, I did not have a very successful freshman season, ERA over 5, got hit all over the park, got sent to summer ball. It was really my first time being away from home. It was like 7 weeks in the Virginia Valley League. And, I hated it. It was tough. I was 18 years old. I was by myself. I was living in a motel, but it was a tremendous experience for my career to understand, hey, this is who I am as a pitcher. This is how I get guys out. This is my keys to success. These are my strengths, my weaknesses. And then I came back and I realized, like, as 2 or 3 years later, that was a transformative experience for me. So I think, these next couple of weeks, we'll see some of those freshmen get in there. Like, again, I'm penciling in Jordan Vargas. I want to see, Brandon Oliveira. I want to see Chris Diaz. I'd like to see those guys get more opportunities to pitch. And then again, this is what they do well. This is what they need to work on. This is what I profile them, in 2025.
Listen, I will see you hopefully this weekend. We hopefully a fun weekend. Got to get some momentum here going into next season, which is what everybody's kind of focused on at this point. And we'll be carrying you through the offseason. Going to be a lot of portal talk, a lot of recruiting talk, and we'll have it for you here on the CanesInSight podcast. So, Javi, appreciate you, and hope we have a better show next week. More to talk about. Okay,
let's hope, D. Let's hope next week we got better things to talk about. With let's talk about a series win, hopefully against the BYU Cougars.
Yes, sir. All right, man. Take it easy.